The self or identity, more narrowly understood, can be reconceptualized in spatial terms as different modes of or vectors of spatial existence. Thus, if we wanted to describe the complex politics of identity in contemporary American urban society, we could contrast four such vectors. First, a population largely demobilized, with little or no ability to move out of predefined and enclosed spaces. Second, a population with highly constrained but extensive lines of mobility. Third, a highly mobile population which is nevertheless excluded from certain key places. And finally, a population living in a voluntarily imposed, increasingly fortress-like space, but which, from within that space, as the result of a variety of technologies, is granted an extraordinary degree of mobility. These rather abstract descriptions can be made more concrete if we apply them to the antagonisms which erupted not long ago in Los Angeles. At the time of the event, the antagonisms seem to have been defined in largely essentialist terms. The only apparent alternative based on the social construction of identity seemed to preclude effective alliance as much as the antagonism itself. But it may be possible to displace the antagonisms from questions of identity per se to the more potentially sympathetic relations among different maps of spatial existence. Los Angeles will be seen then not merely as a dual city, but as a complex system of competing and overlapping mobilities, which of course will have to be located within national, regional, and global spaces as well. The various populations of Los Angeles will not be defined simply in ethnic or racial or class terms, but in terms of the ways these identities are articulated by the different maps of spatial existence available in contemporary urban America, with the groups identified by the press as respectively Black, Latino, Korean, and White, replaced by the above spatial vectors, since the ethnic identifications were often mistaken in their simplicity. Finally, agency-like identity is not simply a matter of places, but is more a matter of spatial relations of places and spaces and the distribution of people within them. As Megan Morris, 1988, points out, such places do not pre-exist as origins. They are the products of efforts to organize a limited space. It is a matter of the structured mobility by which people are given access to particular kinds of places and to the paths that allow one to move to and from such places. In such ways of belonging, operating on the plane of subjectivity, defined kinds of persons in relation to the kinds of experience they have available, then ways of belonging constitutive of agency define a distribution of acts. If subjectivity constitutes homes and places of attachment, temporary addresses for people, agency constitutes strategic installations. These are the specific places and spaces that define particular forms of agency and empower particular populations. In this sense, We can acquire into the conditions of possibility of agency for agency the ability to make history, as it were, is not intrinsic either to subjects or to selves. Agency is the product of diagrams of mobility and placement, which define or map the possibilities of where and how specific vectors of influence can stop and be placed. I am deliberately avoiding a language which will make it sound simply like people who stop and place themselves. Such places are temporary points of belonging and identification, of orientation and installation, creating sites of strategic historical possibilities and activities, and as such they are always contextually defined. They define the forms of empowerment or agency which are available to particular groups as ways of going on, and of going out. Around such places, maps of subjectivity and identity, meaning and pleasure, desire and force can be articulated. A territorializing machine attempts to map the sorts of places that can be occupied and how they can be occupied. It maps how much room there is to move and where and how movement is possible. It produces lines of specific vectors, intensities and densities that differentially enable and enact specific forms of mobility and stability, specific lines of investment, anchoring and freedom. It maps the ways mobility is both enabled by and limited within a field of force. Agency as a human problem is defined by the articulations of subject positions and identities into specific places and spaces, fields of activity, in O'Hanlon's terms, on socially constructed territories. Agency is the empowerment enabled and at particular sites along particular vectors. At the very least, this analysis, however sketchy, suggests that cultural and political identities, which do not themselves correspond exactly to self and agency, while always articulated together in any instance, are nevertheless neither equivalent nor reducible to each other, and neither is equivalent to or reducible to epistemological positions of subjectivity. Culture and the politics of singularity. Recently, a number of authors have challenged the particular confluence of logics which have defined modern theories of identity. Ahmad, 1992, for example, argues that there is often a rather easy slide from an absence of belonging to an excess of belonging predicated on the assumption of migrancy as an ontological and epistemological condition. Similarly, Dadeshwar, 1989, warns against the desire for an identity that fully coheres with the narrative force of theory. Which takes the figures of a theoretical system as the storyline for narrative identity. For example, decentered subjectivity as postmodern reality, dissemination as immigritude. My word for the whole narrative of displacement, which has become a normative experience, is in metropolitan politics of cultural description. I will argue that insofar as the various theories of identity remain grounded in modern logics of difference, individuality and temporality, the radical implications of the increasingly spatial language of such theories remains unrealized and unrealizable. With Dareshwar 1989, I wonder whether we need to raise the possibility and necessity of an entirely different theoretical practice. I am interested in the implications of the alternative logics of otherness, production, and spatiality for a theory of human agency and historical change. In particular, for the movement, I am interested in the possibilities of political identities and alliances. My discussion of agency and its difference from either subjectivity or identity itself will seem to suggest the need for a radical rethinking of political identity and the possibilities of collective agency. It seems to suggest the concept of a belonging without identity, a notion of what might be called singularity as the basis for an alternative politics, a politics based on what Giorgio Agamben, 1993, has called the coming community. This project is political at its core, for as Young, 1990, says, this quest for the singular can be related to the project of constructing a form of knowledge that respects the other without absorbing it into the same. Or I might add, the different. As Dareshwar in 1990 points out, the fetishization and relentless celebration of difference and otherness used here to describe a post-structuralist appropriation of said thesis has displaced any discussion of political identity. Agamben describes singularity as a mode of existence which is neither universal, conceptual, nor particular, individual. He takes as an example of such a mode of existence the existence of the example qua example itself, for the example exists both inside and outside of the class it exemplifies. The example exists by the indifference of the common and the proper, of the genus and the species, of the existential and the accidental. It is the thing with all its properties, none of which, however, constitutes difference. Indifference with respect to properties is what individuates and disseminates singularities. 1993. Moreover, the status of the example is not accomplished once and for all. It is a line of becoming, a shuttling between the common and the singular. In other words, the example is defined not by an appeal to a common universal property and identity, but by its appropriation of belonging to the class in this instance itself. The example belongs to the set which exists alongside of it, and hence it is defined by its substitutability, since it always already belongs in the place of the other. This is an unconditioned substitutability without either representation or possible description, an absolutely unrepresentable community. This community, that on which the example borders, is an empty and indeterminate totality, an external space of possibilities. Thus, a singularity can be defined as a being whose community is mediated not by any condition of belonging, nor by the simple absence of conditions, but by belonging itself. To put this all in simpler terms, Agamben is arguing that the example functions as an example not by virtue of some common property which it shares with all the other possible members of the set, but rather by virtue of its metonymical, understood both literally and specially, relations to the set itself. Any term can become an example of the set because that is at stake is the very claim of belonging to the set. Agamben turns this to politics by considering the events, the alliance of Tiananmen Square. Because if instead of continuing to search for a proper identity in the already improper and senseless form of individuality, humans were to succeed in belonging to this property as such, in making of the proper being, thus not an identity and an individual property, but a singularity without identity, a common and absolutely exposed singularity. Then they will for the first time enter into a community without presuppositions and without subjects. Consider how one will describe the common identity of those who gathered in Tiananmen Square, and whether intentionally or not, came to define and embody a community of opposition not only to the Chinese state, but to the state machine itself. In fact, there is no common identity, no property that defines them apart from the fact that they were there together in that place. It was the fact of belonging that constituted their belonging together. Such a singularity operates as a transport machine, following a logic of involvement, a logic of the next rather than of the proper. It refuses to take any instance as a synecdochal image of the whole. It is only at the intersection of the various lines at the concrete place of belonging that we can identify the different processes of individuation carried out through groups and people, new modes of individuation, and even subjectification with no identity. Such a community will be based only on the exteriority, the exposure of the singularity of belonging. In this sense, we might also reconsider the civil rights movement as a machine of mobilization whose product was a singular belonging rather than a structure of membership. A politics of singularity will need to define places people can belong to, or even more fundamentally, places people can find their way to. Holland Hell, cited in Giroux 1994, described this as the problem of citizenship, the diverse communities to which we belong, the complex interplay of identity and identification, and the differentiated ways in which people participate in social life. Similarly, Mercer 1992 describes what was important about the politics of race of the 1980s as the result of the fact that we actively constructed an elective community of belonging through a variety of practices. Perhaps Hall and Mercer will assent to the argument that in specific contexts, identity can become a marker of peoples abiding in such a singular community, where the community defines and abode marking people's ways of belonging within the structured mobilities of contemporary life. That will be an identity worth struggling to create.